our party can truly feel that we have held the faith. That we shall go in the future is our solemn responsibility of this hour.
1920s were a great time in American history. It is a time that will always be remembered for its flamboyant lifestyles and lavish parties. But unfortunately, this will come to an end soon after. In the 1920s, the agricultural market crashed, causing a domino effect across all parts of American life. Working class people couldn't find jobs, so they couldn't afford to buy consumer goods. With the banks out of money, investors panicked and started selling all their stocks. And when people heard of this, they rushed to banks to get back their investments. However, they found that the banks could not afford to pay them back. People were being laid off left and right. These men couldn't afford to support their families, so oftentimes they just got up and left. During this time, there were some 300,000 people wandering the countryside looking for work. The problem during this time especially was that there was no system to help these men. There's no welfare, no food stamps, no shelter, no way to help these people get back on their feet.
Here you have these people starving and dying on the streets, and they're not being given any opportunities to get themselves out. So what else are they supposed to do?
The scarce opportunities for jobs during this time forced a large group of people to become migrant workers, including drifters, transients, tramps, and hobos. They often illegally rode trains in search of an escape from poverty, commonly finding temporary income from cutting timber, laying rail, harvesting crops, or even begging on the street. Being a transient, living on the streets, having to fend for oneself was not easy. Many of the people were constantly on the move, unable to afford to stay in one place, even if that's what they desired. Living this way forced many people to adapt during this time period. Many migratory workers found out how to survive in lieu of the disaster. In an old interview recovered from an expose on the Dust Bowl, Walter Ballard, a man who had to leave his home in search for work, goes on to explain what it was like riding the rails as an adolescent.
I loved it, and I tell you, you don't recommend that to any young kid because it will get in your blood. You're not going anywhere. You don't care. You just ride. And I wasn't married. I didn't care at all. It'll sure get in your blood because you have zero worries about how you're going to get around. It's paid for. You're going to eat. That was more than what you're doing at home. Probably. Now we stop. I never mooshed a meal ever in my life. I never did. We stopped and worked in any town, anywhere we could get a job. Well, we'd work and get our money and catch a fight on again. I've been hijacked in the yards by the railing bulls, and boy, they'd get rough.
The majority of drifters were white males. Their already higher status based on race and gender made it easiest for them to be a transient. It was much more dangerous for people of color or other genders. An infamous sociologist of the era dedicated his work to documenting the lives of transients. He found unexpected data on women during this time. He estimated that 10% of the adolescents he encountered were girls, usually dressed in male clothing. They had to disguise themselves, hoping to be less of a target in the vulnerable state a transient lives in. He wrote, "Frequently the women exchanged sexual favors for food, protection, and transportation. They did what they had to do to survive." Racial discrimination was also a major issue of this era, especially when traveling according to this lifestyle. Wanda Bridgeforth is willing to give us her testimony growing up African American during this time period, allowing us to hear firsthand experiences.
In the Depression, the men could not get jobs, and especially the black men. Here was my father with a degree in chemistry, and he could not get a job.
At this time, education was not a priority. When the American economy was ruined, the majority of Americans believed the jobs left were meant for pure white males of the country. Other races were dehumanized, and America was overwhelmed. Eventually, we needed to get out of it. We were living in fear for the future of our children. We couldn't remain in this poverty forever, and we needed a source of hope. This hope was Roosevelt. He came in and swept America away with his words, "The only thing you have to fear is fear itself."
This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror.
The banks hated this guy. He was able to convince Congress to pass acts like the New Deal Act and the Emergency Bank Act, which declared a 4-day holiday, convincing Americans to stop withdrawing their money from banks. Then he went around and organized the banks, picking out ones that he didn't think were capable of good business. After this process, he urged Americans to put their savings back in the banks, like nothing had ever happened. Almost 3/4 of the banks had reopened, and he even took the first steps toward ending the prohibition and making it legal for Americans to buy alcohol again.
Roosevelt wasn't much of a god. He had enemies. People found him delusional. In fact, John T. Flynn published a whole book about him being a delusional myth. This guy was so anti-Roosevelt that he took it to himself to publish a whole book about him, talking about what he was like and propaganda behind him.
The New Deal, of course, had its issues, but it brought the Tennessee Valley Authority Act, which was successful, along with other things Roosevelt implemented, like Social Security. Although during this time, the government paid farmers to stop farming, so the goods wouldn't pile up.
This guy allowed workers to unionize and bargain for better working conditions and higher wages in the National Industrial Recovery Act. Of course, these acts allowed people to find something they loved about Roosevelt, but it sparked some hatred for others. Despite Roosevelt's helpful and fueling efforts to help recover and repair the economy, the Great Depression dragged on.
War, that's what got us on our feet the first time, and it did us justice the second time as well. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th in 1941, and America entered World War II. Roosevelt's plan kick-started America into a new wave of prosperity. He did so by introducing socialist ideas, something that was viewed as very radical during this time. In America, before, it was purely a capitalist society. To this day, many conservatives disagree with the steps taken to recover from this decade. After long devastation, Roosevelt's actions proved results.
And that was the Great Depression.